The summer the well ran dry on every farm in the Hatchet Valley save one. The people of that valley gathered in the yard of a woman they had spent 3 years calling a fool, and they stood in the white stillness of a July afternoon with their hats pressed against their chests, and waited for her to decide what to do with them. The heat sat on the land like a hand pressing down. Cicadas had gone quiet hours ago, stunned out of speech by it, and the only sounds were the creak of the old windmill at the far end of the property, and below that, steady and indifferent to the drama arranged around it, the sound of water moving. Clara Voss stood on the porch with both hands loose at her sides, and looked out at 63 faces, some of which had laughed at her in the parking lot of the county clerk's office 3 years prior, and some of which had turned their children away from her gate, and a few of which had signed their names to a letter delivered to her by the water authority suggesting that her land, being of marginal productivity, might be voluntarily surrendered to a consortium for fair market assessment. Gerald Pitt stood at the back of that gathered crowd in his cream-colored shirt with the pearl buttons, and he was the only man present who had not removed his hat, and his expression was the careful blankness of a person who has wagered everything on a hand that has just turned over wrong. Clara Voss said nothing for a long time. The windmill creaked, the water moved, and the land, which remembers everything the owners forget and only whispers so you have to stop and lean in close to hear it, had already given its verdict on all of them. It had given it quietly, the way it gives most things, in inches rather than in proclamations, and most of the people standing in that yard had never learned to listen at the right angle. Clara had. That was the whole story. But the story, to be any use to anyone, had to be told from the beginning, which was 3 years and 2 months and 11 days before that July afternoon, at the probate auction of the Voss family estate, which Clara had attended alone. The Voss farm was 412 acres of cracked clay pan and alkali flat in the western portion of Hatchet Valley, a county whose 2 distinguishing features were a grain elevator that had not run to capacity since the mid-90s and a collective certainty shared across kitchen tables and hardware store counters and the 2 pews nearest the door in First Lutheran, that the land in those parts rewarded only men who had been working it since childhood, and punished everyone else with biblical consistency. Clara Voss, née Dreyer, was 31 years old when she drove 4 hours east from a rented apartment above a dry cleaner in the city with everything she owned in the back of a 15-year-old pickup, which was to say 3 boxes of books, a cast-iron skillet, and $22,000 in a savings account she had built over 9 years of working reception at a civil engineering firm. She was the granddaughter of Eustace Voss, who had homesteaded the western parcel in 1947 and who had died the previous November without a will, which had created a legal tangle that the county probate court had resolved by ordering a sale open to family members first and then to the public. The in-laws attended. Clara's uncle by marriage, David Schreier, drove up in a truck newer and cleaner than anything she had ever owned, along with his 2 sons and their wives, and they stood together near the folding table where the county clerk was accepting bids, and they whispered among themselves and occasionally looked over at Clara with a particular expression of people watching a child play at cards. She had arrived wearing work boots and a canvas jacket, which the wives noted to one another with a small shared smile that carried the freight of an entire editorial opinion. The 412-acre property was in poor condition. The farmhouse had not been lived in since her grandfather's health began failing, which was 4 years prior, and what had not deteriorated had been stripped by the cousins over those 4 years of anything with resale value, so that what remained was the structural shell of a 1940s farmhouse, 3 rooms, a root cellar, a detached barn with a caved-in northwest corner, and 7 acres of untended pasture fronting on the county road. There was also, according to the probate inventory, an undisclosed outbuilding at the rear of the property whose contents had been recorded as miscellaneous agricultural. The auctioneer described it as a storage shed of unknown integrity with an inaccessible interior, which was his way of saying the padlock on it was of a type none of the Schreier family had been able to match a key to. And after a single afternoon of trying, they had concluded with the breezy certainty of people who have not needed to look very hard at anything in some years, that whatever was inside was almost certainly worth less than the trouble of finding out. Clara bid $4,000 for the house and the 7 acres. She paid $5,200 because David Schreier ran it up twice and then stopped, disgusted, when he realized she was going to keep going no matter what. After the gavel came down, she walked to the clerk's table and signed the papers, and David Schreier clapped her on the shoulder, with a heaviness that was not affection, and said, "Well, Clara, you bought yourself a problem." His eldest son, standing just behind him, said something to his brother in a voice calibrated to be barely inaudible that made both of them laugh. Clara looked at the signature she had just written on the deed, and then she looked at the key the clerk handed her, which was a standard master padlock key that the county assessor had finally sourced that same morning from a locksmith 2 counties over after 3 failed attempts. And she put it in her jacket pocket and said thank you to the clerk and walked to her truck and drove out to the property alone, which she would do almost every morning for the next 3 years. The farmhouse was worse than it had been described, which she had expected, and she spent the first 3 weeks sleeping in the truck and doing the repairs in order of structural necessity, which meant the roof before the windows and the windows before the floors and the floors before anything else. She had $19,040 remaining after the purchase, the deed filing fees, and a cord of dimensional lumber, and she did the arithmetic on the tailgate of the truck every evening with a carpenter's pencil on the back of whatever paper was at hand. The arithmetic of small money is its own discipline. You do not ask whether you can afford the thing. You ask how many weeks the thing sets you back and whether the setback is survivable. The roof set her back 6 weeks of materials cost. The windows set her back 2. The floor she did herself from salvaged boards she pulled from the collapsed corner of the barn, which took 4 weeks of evenings, but cost her only a rented floor sander and $40 of finishing compound. She learned that she had a talent for working with what was already present, which is not the same as a talent for carpentry, but is perhaps more useful on a budget of $19,000 in a county where lumber prices float on diesel costs. By the end of the first month, she had a roof that kept rain out, and windows that kept wind out, and a floor that did not give underfoot traffic. And she moved out of the truck and into the house, where she slept on a cot in the center of the main room, and woke each morning to the sound of what she assumed at first was the wind in the broken gutter, until one morning she was still enough and quiet enough to recognize that it was not the gutter at all. It was water, moving water, faint as a rumor, coming from somewhere on the rear of the property. She put her boots on and walked out through the pasture grass, which was knee-high and gray with drought dust, and she found the outbuilding that the probate inventory had noted, a low, windowless structure of limestone block with a cedar shake roof that had somehow held its integrity across 40 years of weather. She put the key in the padlock and opened the door. What she found took her the better part of an hour to fully comprehend. Her grandfather, Eustace Voss, had spent the last 11 years of his life diverting, by incremental and patient engineering, a subsurface seep that emerged on the northwest edge of the property into a series of lined cisterns running the length of that outbuilding. There were 4 of them, poured concrete basins each 12 feet long and 4 feet deep, fed by a gravity channel from the seep and connected to one another by overflow pipes so that the water moved in sequence and stayed fresh. The cisterns were full. They had been full, according to the copper water gauge Eustace had installed on the intake pipe, for at least 2 years. The seep, which had no name on any county survey and did not appear on any water rights registry Clara could locate, ran at a rate she estimated by timing a tin cup fill as approximately 40 gallons per hour. She stood in the cool dim of that room with the faint sound of moving water all around her and understood two things simultaneously. The first was that her grandfather had known this was here and had not told the Schreiers, which was a communication in itself. The second was that nobody in the county was going to believe a word of it until she had documentation in her hand, and a lawyer who could tell her what she had and what it was worth, and that until that moment the only right strategy was to say nothing to anyone, and to listen to the land the way the land was clearly trying to be listened to. She kept the door locked. She had the only key. She went back to the house and put the carpenter's pencil to the tailgate cardboard again and revised the arithmetic. The arithmetic had changed considerably. It was in the second month that Marta Feldenkrais appeared. She was 74 years old, born in the Carpathian Basin, and had been farming the adjacent 80 acres for 31 years alone since her husband died, which made her, in the estimation of the county, an eccentric at best and a cautionary lesson at worst. She arrived at Clara's fence line one morning with a jar of preserved plums and no explanation of her presence, and looked at Clara's repaired roof and the cleared pasture, and said, in an accent that thickened whenever she was being deliberate, "You are listening the wrong direction. You are listening up for rain, like everyone here. The water in this country does not come down. It comes up if you learn to ask." Then she gave Clara the plums and walked back to her property without further elaboration. Clara ate the plums and thought about what had been said, and she thought about the cisterns in the locked-out building, and she thought that Marta Feldenkrais had perhaps known Eustace Voss better than any member of his family had. She went to Marta's fence line the following morning with the empty jar and 2 questions, and what she got in return was a conversation that lasted 4 hours and changed the entire shape of what she thought she was doing. Marta did not believe in wasting water on conventional pasture grass. She grew emmer wheat, an ancient grain variety she had brought as seed from relatives in the old country, and her irrigation method was a subsurface ceramic pipe system of her own devising that delivered moisture directly to root level with almost no surface evaporation. The emmer grew on 12 inches of annual rainfall without complaint. It was, she told Clara, a grain that remembered what the land here used to be before the topsoil was stripped for cash crops. It does not need to be coaxed. It only needs to not be argued with. She paused in that particularly deliberate way she had, and looked at Clara over the fence and said, "This is the whole thing, the whole secret of any land anywhere. It does not need your instruction. It needs your attention. The land knows what it is. You are only here to notice and to not get in the way." This became, in Clara's interior monologue, the refrain she returned to every time the work felt wrong, or the money felt short, or the isolation felt like a verdict rather than a temporary condition. It does not need your instruction. It needs your attention. She said it quietly to herself on the worst evenings, the way other people say prayers, not because she was certain it was true, but because it kept her hands moving in the right direction. It was in the 3rd month that the boy appeared. His name was Tomas, and he was 9 years old, and he belonged to the Rivas family who leased 40 acres on the county road 2 miles south, and who were in the 7th consecutive year of trying to grow dryland corn on soil that had not wanted to grow dryland corn since approximately the Eisenhower administration. He arrived at Clara's fence line one afternoon on a bicycle, with a flat rear tire and a gap in his front teeth, and looked at her new plowed kitchen garden with an expression of complete and unguarded scientific interest. He asked what she was planting. She told him. He asked why in those rows, and not different rows. She explained about solar angle and windbreak. He considered this with the seriousness of a consulting engineer and said, "That makes sense," and then asked if he could come back and watch. He came back 3 times a week for the remainder of that year and the 2 years following, and he brought a composition notebook in which he drew diagrams of everything he observed with a precision that Clara found quietly astonishing. He named the 6 chickens she acquired in the 4th month. He named them for navigators: Magellan, Cabot, Drake, Hudson, Cartier, and the smallest one, who found her way out of any enclosure attempted, he named simply the Admiral, which seemed to Clara correct. Tomas never mocked. He never told anyone in town what he saw on the property. He was, in that way, completely trustworthy, which is not a thing you can teach, but only recognize, and Clara recognized it in him and never forgot it. The town's opinion of her remained fixed and largely unfavorable through the first year and into the second. She heard it most clearly the one afternoon per week she drove into Millhaven to get mail and hardware store supplies, where the opinion expressed itself as a particular quality of conversational pause whenever she entered a space, a brief reorganization of the room's social geometry around her, as though she were a piece of furniture placed in an inconvenient location. She was referred to in the hardware store, once and in her hearing, as that Voss woman from the old place, with the inflection that made clear the primary adjective was not Voss. She had heard the same quality of pause her whole life in different rooms, and had learned to treat it as information rather than injury. She was a woman alone in a county that considered aloneness a symptom in a woman, and she understood that the only reply available to her was the kind that came out of the ground rather than out of her mouth. Gerald Pitt introduced himself in her 8th month. He was the regional acquisitions agent for the Consolidated Valley Agricultural Trust, which was the formal name for the holding company that had spent 6 years quietly purchasing distressed farmland in the county and leasing it back at rates that, as Marta had told her once with considerable precision, began at uncomfortable and arrived at punishing within 4 years. He wore the cream-colored shirt even then, and drove a pickup that was too clean for the county roads, and smiled with all his teeth in a manner that Clara's experience as a receptionist had trained her to recognize as the facial expression of a person who wants something from you and has already decided what it will cost him to get it. He told her he was familiar with her property, that the trust had made a prior assessment of the Voss parcel and found the carrying capacity limited, and that given the cost of rehabilitation she would certainly face over the coming years, the trust was prepared to make a generous offer at $12,000 for the full 412 acres. She told him the parcel was 412 acres only on the tax map, that what she owned was 7 acres and a house, and that she was not interested. He said she might want to think about it, given how quickly a place could go underwater on the maintenance alone. She said she appreciated his concern and thanked him for stopping by. He drove away, and she watched the dust of the county roads settle, and thought about his use of the phrase she might want to think about it, which was a phrase that assumed she had not been thinking since before he arrived. And she filed that assumption next to the first arithmetic she had done on the tailgate cardboard, which she had kept folded in the kitchen drawer for reasons she could not have fully articulated, but which she understood instinctively to be important. He came back 4 months later with a revised offer of $18,000. She declined again, briefly, and without explanation, and he spent another 30 seconds looking past her into the property before driving away. She understood that he was looking for something specific. The question was what he already knew and what he was still guessing at. The first outside confirmation came in Clara's 14th month, in the form of a woman named Dr. Sylvie Marchetti, a hydrologist from the State University who was conducting a surface survey of subsurface moisture anomalies in the Western Valley Basin. She appeared at the fence line with a clipboard and a request to take a single ground-penetrating radar scan of Clara's rear pasture, explaining that her instruments had shown an anomalous subsurface moisture signature on the aerial map. Clara let her in and showed her the outbuilding and the cisterns and her grandfather's copper gauge, and Dr. Marchetti stood in the low light of that room and was quiet for a long time, and then said, in a voice stripped of professional distance, "Do you understand what you have here?" Clara said she believed she was beginning to. Dr. Marchetti told her that the seep was fed by a confined aquifer stratum of remarkable extent for the basin, and that the flow rate was consistent with a recharge source that made the surface seep effectively perpetual on any human planning horizon. She said that in her professional assessment, the sustainable annual yield from properly managed extraction would be on the order of 350,000 gallons per year without meaningfully depleting the source. She paused and looked at Clara and said, "You should have this documented and registered immediately. The water rights registry for this county is a mess, and there are parties who have been looking for this seep for years." Clara registered the water rights the following week through a water law attorney in the county seat. The filing fee was $240, and she paid it from the sale of a half-cord of firewood she had split herself from deadfall timber, which struck her as the precisely correct economy for the transaction. Then she closed the outbuilding door and padlocked it, and continued to be pitied by the county for another 18 months, because the arithmetic had also told her that timing was a resource, and that a resource spent too early was a resource wasted. She planted Marta's emmer wheat on 3 acres of the cleared pasture, and watched it come up gray-green and sturdy in the late spring rains, and she ran a gravity drip line from the cistern overflow to the kitchen garden, and she and Thomas built a second small henhouse from salvaged barn lumber in the 6th weekend they worked together, and the Admiral and her 5 colleagues began producing at a rate that supplied Clara's table, Marta's table, and a small weekly surplus that Clara sold from a cooler at the end of the county road on Sunday mornings. She said nothing to anyone about the water. Marta knew. Tomas, in the way of attentive children, had understood without being told, and had put a single diagram of the cistern layout in his notebook, and then turned to a fresh page without comment. The knowledge sat under the property like the water itself, present and patient and unhurried. Gerald Pitt came back a 3rd time in her 20th month, and this time he brought a letter on trust letterhead noting that the Water Authority had flagged the Voss parcel in a Regional Resource Inventory review, and that the trust, as a major stakeholder in valley agriculture, had a procedural standing to request a cooperative water-sharing negotiation. The letter used the word cooperative 4 times in 2 pages, which Clara counted, and offered to purchase the water rights outright for $65,000 with a leaseback provision that would allow her continued residential use of the property. She read the letter twice sitting at her kitchen table with Tomas's notebook open next to her at the diagram page, and she thought about the arithmetic, and she thought about the phrase procedural standing, which was not the same as legal right, and she put the letter in the kitchen drawer next to the old tailgate cardboard and called the water law attorney, who told her that the trust's procedural standing amounted to the right to file a comment letter, not to compel negotiation, and that she was under no obligation to respond. She did not respond. The silence cost Gerald Pitt exactly what she intended it to cost him, which was certainty. A man who does not know what you know is a man who has to guess, and guessing is expensive. The drought arrived the following spring. It arrived the way the worst ones do, not as a single event, but as an accumulation of small failures. The March rains that did not come, then the April rains that came but did not amount, then the May rains that appeared on the forecast twice and materialized not at all, and then June arriving like the open door of a furnace and not closing. By the last week of June, the county road was pale as bone, and the Hatchet Creek had dropped to a chain of standing pools, and the wheat on the Schreier operation east of town had gone the color of straw 3 weeks before it should have. Water from the county main was on a rationing schedule by July 3rd. Livestock operations began early emergency feed protocols, and the price of transported water trucked in from the reservoir 60 miles north hit 4 cents per gallon and kept moving. 4 cents does not sound like a crisis until you multiply it by the number of gallons a beef cattle operation requires on a 105-degree afternoon, and then the arithmetic arranges itself into a shape that looks very much like the end of everything. Clara's emmer wheat was fine. The subsurface drip system Marta had shown her how to lay down delivered moisture at root depth, and the emmer, which had been bred across centuries for exactly this kind of regional stubbornness, stood green and upright, while every other grain operation in visual range went the color of defeat. Her chickens were fine. Her kitchen garden was producing at full capacity. The cisterns were at 83% capacity and refilling at the steady rate they had maintained since the day she opened the door. She walked to Marta's fence line in the third week of June, and they stood on either side of the wire and looked at the valley, and Marta said, in the deliberate cadence she used for things she wanted to be heard precisely, "The land knew this was coming. It has known since before either of us was born. This is what it was telling your grandfather, and your grandfather tried to write it down in pipes and cisterns so that someone after him would read it." She looked at Clara over the fence the way she had that first morning and said, "You read it. Not everyone can do that. That is the whole thing right there." It was in the second week of July that Gerald Pitt made his final move. He had spent the drought consolidating the trust's position, calling in notes on 3 distressed operations, acquiring a quarter share in the rationed county main distribution schedule, and positioning himself, through a quiet conversation with 2 members of the Water Authority Board, as the logical broker for any emergency water access in the valley. He called a public meeting at the Millhaven Grange Hall, framed as a community emergency resource session, and invited the valley landowners, including Clara and 2 members of the Water Authority. And he presented a proposal by which the trust would purchase Clara's water rights for $90,000, immediately establish a metered distribution system, and sell emergency access to valley farmers at what he described as a recovery cost rate of 2.5 cents per gallon, which was below the trucking cost and which he presented as an act of community service. The room wanted to believe him. The room was desperate enough to believe anything that came attached to a number lower than 4 cents. David Schreier, whose corn operation had already lost 40% of its yield projection and who was looking at a loan call in September, nodded twice during the presentation and looked at Clara in a way that mixed apology with desperation in roughly equal proportion. Clara sat in the second row and listened to all of it and waited. Gerald Pitt turned to her during the question period and said, with the full warmth of his professional smile, that he hoped Clara understood the community stake here and that $90,000 was a fair number for a woman working 400 acres alone. She did not correct the acreage this time. She noted instead that the number he had quoted for distribution, 2.5 cents per gallon, applied to a yield of 350,000 annual gallons worked out to an annual revenue of $8,750 for the trust, which would own the rights outright under his proposal, while she received a one-time payment of $90,000 and no further share. She said this plainly as an arithmetic observation, not as an accusation. Then she asked him how he had arrived at the figure of 350,000 gallons annual yield for a seep whose flow documentation was filed with the county registry under a restricted access designation that required her signed authorization to view. The room was completely quiet. Gerald Pitt said that his team had made an independent hydrological estimate. Clara said that his team's estimate matched Dr. Marchetti's figure to within 2%, which was closer than an independent estimate from surface observation could reasonably arrive at, and that the only filed documentation of that figure was in the restricted registry, and that the registry access log, which she had requested a copy of under the county transparency provision 2 weeks earlier when she began to suspect where this meeting was heading, showed an access event under a trust affiliate entity name 7 months prior, without her authorization, which was a violation of the registry statute, and which she had documented with the water law attorney along with a formal complaint that had been sitting, ready to file, in the attorney's outbox for 11 days. She said this quietly and without drama, in the same register in which she might have described the weather, and she watched the room absorb it. Gerald Pitt said nothing. The pearl buttons on his cream shirt caught the fluorescent light, and his face did not change, but something behind his face changed, the way the color goes out of a sky 2 hours before a storm, and the room could see it. One of the Water Authority members cleared his throat and said that unauthorized registry access was a Class B civil violation, and asked if Clara intended to file. She said that depended entirely on how the rest of the evening went. She stood and turned to face the room, which was 63 faces in that Grange Hall, and she said that she had a proposal of her own, and that her proposal was this. She would make available to any valley operation currently under drought emergency, at no charge for the water itself, access to the seep output at a rate governed only by the sustainable yield ceiling established by Dr. Marchetti's study to be divided proportionally by acreage among the participating operations, with each participant contributing 4 hours of labor per week to the maintenance of the distribution system, because the labor was the only thing she could not do alone, and the water was not something she had made, but something she had found. And you did not profit from a gift by selling it to the people it was given for. She said the arrangement would run for the duration of the drought and be renegotiated afterward. She said that Gerald Pitt and the trust were welcome to participate in the labor arrangement at the same rate as any other valley operation, under the same terms, which were, the water is free, the work is yours. David Schreier was the first one to remove his hat. He held it against his chest and looked at the floor for a moment, and then looked up at her and said, "Thank you, Clara." And the 2 words carried the full weight of everything he had not said in the parking lot of the county clerk's office 3 years and 2 months prior, and she received them without comment. Gerald Pitt left the hall while the room was still rearranging itself around the new understanding of what had just happened. He did not speak to Clara or to the Water Authority members, and he drove out of Mill Haven that night, and the Trust's active acquisition file on Hatchet Valley properties was, according to a document Marta showed Clara 2 months later, quietly closed for administrative review, which in Trust corporate language meant that the man responsible for the strategy had left the organization and no one was eager to claim ownership of the approach. The distribution system took 11 days to build. Clara and Thomas laid the main trunk line from the cistern outflow to a central manifold in the rear pasture, and from that manifold 11 secondary lines ran to the fence lines of 11 different operations, and 53 people showed up over those 11 days to dig and lay pipe and connect fittings, and Tomas kept the notebook open the whole time and diagrammed the full system across 8 pages with the systematic care of an engineer who knows the document will matter later, which it did, because the county extension office eventually requested a copy and used it in a regional water management study the following year. The labor was not organized or assigned. It simply appeared each morning in the form of people with shovels who had figured out independently where they needed to stand and what needed to happen next, which was the most efficient system Clara had ever been part of, and which she attributed to the fact that thirsty people who have been given a clear task have no energy left over for inefficiency. The rains came in mid-August, not as a single deluge, but as 3 steady systems over 10 days that reset the creek level and filled the stock tanks and broke the heat with the finality of a verdict. The emmer wheat, which had been holding its ground for 11 weeks, headed out in the week after the first rain with a density that Marta walked the rows of with her hands trailing through the grain and her face carrying an expression Clara had not seen on it before, which was simple happiness of the kind that has waited long enough to be sure of itself. They harvested together in the 3rd week of August, Clara and Thomas and Marta, and 4 of the Rivas family members who came over from the south parcel, and the yield per acre came in at 61 bushels, which was 9 bushels above the regional dryland average for a normal rainfall year, in a year that had produced the worst drought in 23 years of county records. Marta said, without particular emphasis, "You see, the wheat was not being grown. It was being allowed. There is a difference, and the difference is everything." Tomas had turned 11 by then, and his notebook was full, and he was on his second one. He did not name the new chickens for navigators. He named them for hydrologists, because he had decided somewhere in the 11 days of pipeline work what he wanted to do with his life. And he told Clara this with the directness he had always brought to practical matters. She told him he was going to be very good at it. He accepted this assessment and went back to his notebook, which was the correct response. In the cool of the following October, Clara sat on her porch in the evening and looked at the 7 acres of her property in the last of the day's light, and did the arithmetic one more time, which was a habit she had never broken and did not intend to. The house was worth something now, probably $40,000 in the current market, repaired and documented, and with the water rights attached. The emmer wheat had sold to a regional mill at a premium that Marta had negotiated with the calm authority of someone who knew she was selling a thing the mill could not easily source elsewhere, and Clara's 3-acre share had come to $4,200. The distribution arrangement had been renewed for the following season by a vote of the 11 participating operations, with a modest infrastructure fee of $30 per household to cover materials for winter insulation of the pipes, which had covered the cost with $60 left over that Clara put in the kitchen drawer next to the tailgate arithmetic and the trust letter and the water registry access complaint, which she had ultimately not filed, because the filing would have cost Gerald Pitt money, but not the thing he had already lost, which was the room. Marta came by that evening with another jar of preserved plums and sat in the second chair on the porch, which Clara had built from the last of the barn salvage in a week the previous spring, and they sat together without speaking for a considerable time, looking at the property and listening to the windmill, and below it, as always, the water. Marta said eventually, "Your grandfather built that room with the water because he believed someone after him would be able to hear what it was saying." She was quiet a moment. "He was right," she said. And then, with the precise emphasis of someone who knows where the sentence needs to land, she said, "The land does not need your instruction. It needs your attention." Clara had said it to herself on perhaps 200 evenings over 3 years in the dark of the main room, when the arithmetic had looked wrong and the isolation had felt permanent, and hearing it outside her own head, in Marta's voice, on a cool October evening, with the emmer stubble gold in the last light, and the water steady under the windmill's creak, and Tomas's bicycle propped against the fence post, where he had left it that afternoon before his mother called him in for supper, it landed differently than it had on any of those evenings. It landed like something finished, like a door that had been ajar for 3 years and had finally, without drama, swung fully open. She ate one of the plums and looked at her property, which was 7 acres and a farmhouse and a locked-out building she no longer needed to keep locked, and she thought that it was exactly enough. She thought that the in-laws had been right that she had bought herself a problem, but that a problem and a gift looked identical from the outside when you didn't know what was behind the only door worth opening, and that the difference between them was not in the property, but in whether you were the kind of person who listened at the right angle. She was. She had always been. She had needed the land to confirm it, and it had, in the patient, unhurried way it confirmed everything, which was by continuing to be itself long enough for the right person to stop arguing with it and simply pay attention. The windmill turned. The water moved. The evening came down across the valley the way evenings come in country where the sky is wide enough to make the coming of dark a gradual and forgiving thing, and Clara Voss sat in the chair she had built herself on the porch of the house. She had repaired herself on the 7 acres she had paid for herself, and she was home.
Ça se passe quand par rapport au manga? Ça se passe très longtemps après. Alors moi j'ai pas tout vu mais du manga. Mais en fait Tristan, là, le héros principal, là, c'est le fils de Méliodas. Ça se passe très longtemps après. Ah, c'est Drake. Ouais, il est colère lui, hein. Autant sa sœur elle est gentille lui.
マニそこをどけ。
Mani, elle va te payer pour avoir corrompu ton esprit.
許すわけにはいかぬ。
違います兄上。
Bah non, il est pas très
どう
bon.
してこんなことをするのですか。兄上だって始祖のドラゴンの危険性を分かっているはずです。
我はドラゴン